Tutorials are excellent at teaching you about a piece of the overall development puzzle, but sometimes you want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. That way, you can see where those puzzle pieces you've been collecting fit into place. This video is going to have a bit bigger picture overview. We're going to build a small demo of an MVC application and its accompanying database. We'll set up a form to collect data, capture that data, and put it into our database. We'll then get our data back out of our database and display it on another form. The goal is to show the data access process from beginning to end in ASP.NET MVC. This won't be a full application, and we won't complete the full process since we won't be putting this into source control, we won't be deploying this application, and we won't be setting up authentication. Now, if you want to see a full application being developed, you might be interested in one of my start to finish courses on imtimcorey.com. If the one you want isn't there, chances are it's probably in the works. Either way, also consider using the link in the description to sign up for my mailing list. There, you'll hear about new courses, changes to my content, and exclusive discounts on courses. Okay, let's get started in Visual Studio. We're going to start right away with a File, New Project. Let's place this in the Demos folder. And we'll say ASP.NET Web Application Full .NET Framework, not the core. So it's under C# Web, it's the full framework version. We're going to cover core in a future video, but for now we're going to stick with what's generally out there in the marketplace right now for existing applications. For new applications, you'll probably want to go core. But for learning how ASP.NET works and for certain circumstances, MVC is still the way to go. But for the most part, for brand new applications, probably core is a better bet, but there's an awful lot still out here with MVC. So we're going to cover that first. Let's call this MVC app, and we'll call this MVC data from database to form. It's a little long, but it's descriptive. Let's hit OK. And we're going to be asked what type of template we want to use. We want to use the MVC template. We're not going to use web forms or API or Docker or unit tests. And we're not going to use authentication. So we're going to leave it right as it is at MVC. We'll hit OK. And that will scaffold up the project. It will also bring down, as you see in the lower left-hand corner here, it brings down a bunch of NuGet packages to get us started on all the tools we'll need for this application. Now, again, this is going to be focused primarily on moving data through an application. So let's go ahead and add a new project. And we'll say under desktop, there's class library.NET Framework version, the full .NET Framework version. We're going to call this our data library. So that's going to be where all of our data access lives. We'll go ahead and delete class 1. And then we're going to add one more project. And this is going to actually be in the other languages, SQL Server. We're going to add that SQL Server data project. Now, if you're not familiar, I do have a video that I just released a couple of videos ago on this topic, or actually, I think last week. So that'll hopefully help you with this. What that's going to do is allow me to create a SQL Server that then you can have. So when you take the source code from me, you can build it and publish it locally and then point to it and use it. So we're going to call this our DemoDB. Let's call it MVC DemoDB. That way it's a little more clear. So there we go. So now, with that being added, we'll have the 3 projects we need for our full scope of our application. Now, we're not going to go into depth on modifying the MVC, so we're just going to start with something simple. So in the home controller, we're going to, actually, let's start with models first. Let's start with data first. So in the models, let's add a class, and we'll call this the, let's be simple and call it the employee model. And so the idea here is we're going to create this little form that employees can fill out with their information. And let's go ahead and list what that information will be. So start with employee ID. So first name, last name, and then email address. We're going to also have, since this is a view, this is a model for our UI, our MVC project, the entire thing is our user interface. So even though there's models in here and controllers, that's still UI code, just to be clear on that. So this is a UI model. So I'm going to have another string called confirm email. And then let's create a couple more. Password, confirm password. That should be good. So now we have those fields where I create a form where an employee can fill out this information. Say they're signing into our system for the first time. They give us the employee ID, first name, last name, their email address, and their password, and it sets up an account for them. So now what we need to do in a home controller, let's create an action called sign up. And it's really the same thing as all these other ones. So let's just copy and paste this. And we'll call it sign up. And this is the employee sign up. So that's the view portion of it, the GET request. So let's create a view for it. Notice we don't have any yet. We have about, contact, and index. That's it. So if we right click and say add view, now we could fill it into the model. I'm not going to yet. I want to show you, well, you know what? Let's do it. So I'm going to put the model in first. We're going to do a create. So it's going to be a create template. And the model is going to be an employee model. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways of going about this, how you can create this form. This is probably my favorite, just because it gives you all the fancy boilerplate stuff that you might want, and then you can just decide not to keep some of it, versus other methods are less value to you. They don't give you as much, but you can add to it. And I'd rather take things away because of the fact that it's easier to remember what to delete than it is to remember what to type. So this way, if we use the create template, it's going to create a form for creating a record. And we're going to have it use this model as the method for creating that form. So it's going to scaffold it all out for us. Let's hit add. You'll notice down here, it's going to pop up with a new entry. There we go, sign up. And notice all the code that it created for us. That's a lot of code. And what this code is, and let's just take us off from it, is it starts off with saying, okay, here's the model we're bringing in. That's the employee model. And we have the view bag title of sign up. Let's make it employee sign up. That's a little clearer. And let's make it employee sign up here. And now it creates the begin form. This is razor syntax. That's the @ symbol. And so the razor syntax allows us to bring C# into our HTML form, which is really convenient. So it starts off a form. So it's going to create the form tag and set up some initial stuff for the form. And one of the first things it does is it brings in an anti-forgery token. And so what that does is it puts a hidden field on your form, and then you can check for that value in the control when it comes back. And it's really, you don't really notice almost. But what it allows you to do is make sure that people aren't trying to post or pretend like they're posting your form, but doing it directly instead of through the actual web page and trying to bypass stuff. So that anti-forgery token is a really easy thing to add to increase your security of your form. All right, then it creates these sections. So we have employee model, and this is, so that's the header for the overall form, and then a validation summary. And then right here is our first form group. And a form group represents one entry point or one piece of data we're entering into a form. So in this case, we got the employee ID, then we have first name, we have last name, we have address, confirm email. Email address, confirm email, password, and confirm password. So all of this set up, and they have all these complicated label for, and then it's got the model, and then it's got the arrow and the model.password, and the editor for, and validation message. What this is doing, and this is why I like it, the fact that the template creates this for us instead of us typing this out, because it's hard to remember all this stuff. But what it does is it allows us to do a lot of configuring and tweaking of our form without having to do any work in the HTML itself. So we'll see that in just a minute. But for right now, what we're going to do is we're going to get ready to launch this just so you can see this form just as it is, boilerplate. I only changed the employee sign up here and the view bag title. So it's pretty boilerplate, but first let's go ahead and go to layout. And we're going to add one item. Let's add it right after home, and we'll call it the sign up. And it's the sign up method in the home controller. So that's controller. That's the method or the action. And then here is the link name, or what's going to say in the link itself. So with that being said, that should be all we need to get started on seeing what our application looks like. Let's bring this down here. Once it starts up, now we can see that the website loaded up. Now we have a sign up button right here. We click it, and there's our form. I mean, we didn't have to do anything except say use a template, and I modified, of course, this right here. So it says employee model. That's not really cool. We'll change that. And then it's got employee ID, which sure, we want to see that, but it's kind of running together there. And first name kind of runs together, and last name. And if I don't fill anything out and I hit create, employee ID is required. Okay, so I'll put 1 there. And it seems to do something. It wipes the form out. And that's kind of weird. And if I hit refresh here, it's going to say, do you want to resubmit the form? Which means that the form was submitted with just that 1 in there. And that's not great either. So, it's not checking for it to make sure that my password matches my confirmed password. A whole bunch of, not great stuff, but at least it's a start, right? Well, there are things we can do to make this better really quick. So let's go over to our model. Now, this employee ID already said that is required, but we also want to add that it has to be in a certain range, because employee IDs, maybe they're 6 digits long. So let's stop. Hit stop here. Maybe let's start with a range. Hit Control dot to add the using system.component model .data annotations here. So you say range and say, you know what? This has to be a minimum, and it can be int or it can be a double, but let's say a minimum of, there's 6 digits. Yep, that's 6 digits. And we'll do, the maximum has to be, 999999, because that's our employee ID range, is somewhere in the 6-digit range. And then if we want to, we can add an error message here. So let's do that. So we can say error message. We don't have to add this. Notice the square brackets here. It's optional. But we're going to say that error message is you need to enter a valid employee ID. Something simple. And one thing that's yelling at me before, because it says that argument 1 can't be of int. It has to be a system.type. And argument 2 cannot convert from int to string. Which seems odd, because if you go here, it looks like you can, because it's actually here, minimum, maximum, and we're on an error message. But the problem is that we have to specify. Because right now we're actually on this one, which says type, then minimum maximum. So if we just say error message equals, and that allows us to do it in that order. So minimum, maximum, and the error message. And we also said that the employee ID was kind of clunky, just putting that right on the screen as the label. So let's say instead display, and we can say name equals employee ID, like that. Put the space in there. I also capitalized the D, so it's more in line with what you'd see probably in the real world. So these are data annotations, and they allow us to modify our model. So let's go ahead and do this on a few more. In fact, I'm just going to copy and paste just to save some time here, and say this is the first name. And I'm also going to say this one's required. And if they don't provide it, then I'm going to say you need to give us your first name. So let's grab that. We're going to do the same thing for last name. And then email address, we'll do the same thing. Now, this one's a little bit interesting. We're not going to require it, even though you'd think, well, you have to have it confirm. But instead, we're going to say compare, and then give it which field we're going to compare it to. In this case, email address. And so it's going to compare it to the email address. And then we're also going to say the error message equals the email, and confirm email must match. And we are going to give it a display name, so let's do that too. And then password, we're going to say the data type. So data type is data type dot password. We'll do the same for email address in just a minute. We're also going to add to this another attribute called string length. We're going to say that the maximum length for the string is going to be, and this is silly. This actually I had a problem at bank. They said the maximum length of my password had to be no more than 20 characters. That's kind of ridiculous. I would set this at 100. So password can be at least 100 or at most 100 characters long. That seems probably good enough. But we're going to say that minimum length equals, and let's say something more reasonable. Let's say 10 characters. I know it seems like a lot, but I think that's a pretty decent password. And then we're going to say that the error message equals you need to provide a long enough password. Okay, and we'll make this required. And say that the error message equals you must have a password. And we're also going to say notice all the annotations we got here? It's okay. I mean, it is what it is. Because we're defining it here so we can use it over and over in multiple places. We're just going to say this password. We probably don't have to since they're both called that, but maybe a little more clear. Here, we're going to say that the data type is still password for our confirm. We're not going to worry about the requirements for length or required or any of that kind of stuff. We're just going to do the compare to. So this is the password. And the error message equals your password and confirm password do not match. So I have an error message here for that. For email address, let's go ahead and add that one more thing on there that we almost got past, which is the data type. And this is a email address. Notice all the different types we have here. So we have credit card, currency, custom, date time, all the rest. Some great stuff in here. URL. What it'll do is it'll do basically validation based upon these different rules. So email address is actually going to validate to make sure it's a valid email address. So let's leave it like that for now. Let's see how our form looks now with just that change and see if we can't get a little better view on what's going on here. So, all right, we got it loaded. Let's go to sign up. And now notice employee ID is a space, confirm email is a space. We forgot confirm password, so we got to fix that. If we type out a password here, notice it just has the dots. If I click off it, it's not long enough. If I make it long enough, my password and confirm password do not match. So it's tracking these kind of things, which is great. And it's doing it on the client side. And this is actually jQuery validation that comes kind of bundled already with MVC. And if you're not a big fan of jQuery, which you should be, the reason it's got a bad name is because we've overused it. And there's some better tools out there now that are a little more streamlined and specific for what we want. But for this case, it's great for us. It does the validation. It's built in. And it's one less thing to worry about when you're starting up with MVC. As you move forward, maybe you want to look at replacing that library with something a little more full-featured or a little more lean. But for the most part, this is perfect for getting started. Okay, we'll put 1 in there for our employee ID. It's not a valid employee ID. Now it's a valid employee ID. Now it's not again. So there you go. Gonna skip over. Let's just put a letter in here. I'll skip back and hit take it away. And it says, hey, you get a first name. Because I just kind of skipped over, it's saying, well, you're coming back to it. If I say test here, it's not a valid email address. Test at, still not a valid email address. Test.com, now it's a valid email address. And if I say test, the email and confirm email must match. So now you got something going on here. If we hit create, it's not doing anything yet because it's saying you're not done yet. Now, if I start giving passwords and everything out, there we go. And now I hit create. The form clears away, but nothing really happens. So let's work on that next. Now we have this form kind of cleaned up. We want to fix confirm password. I'm also going to show you one other thing you can do. So let's start with confirm password. Let's grab that display. Whoops. There we go. And now we should say confirm password. Then come over to my signup.cs HTML file. We have this whole form here. But let's do this. Let's minimize this right here. That's basically the whole form. Then I'm going to highlight it, and I'm going to hit my comment out. So comment the whole section out. So the form really should be nothing. It's got the anti-forgery token, the begin form, and that's it until the end form. But what I can do here, I'm going to say at HTML dot, I'm going to say editor for model. That's it. Okay. Now let's run this again. I want to show you this little built-in. It's not something you use all the time, but it's something that can be useful in the cases where you want to just create a quick little form. There's my form. And it looks pretty similar. It's got some differences, but it's a form. In fact, if I start doing this, it's got the validation. So if I hit submit, and it's actually the wrong form. It's the editor for. I think I need create for. But anyways, this form, it works in a similar manner. It's really good for a quick start on a form. If you just want to, get something out quick, boom, that one line will do it. But for anything where you need to edit any of this stuff here, I think you'd rather go the scaffold route, which does all the work for you that you can then modify. So let's hit stop. I'm just going to undo those changes here. There we go. So now our form is back the way it was. And now you can tweak things like, let's move this div around, or in this case, that's just horrible. Sign up for our online account. Sounds great. Just something different than the model. So there's our form. If we look into each one of these things, we can kind of see how those different things worked. So we have, let's look down here, it's a little more distinct. We have a form group, and this form group is for first name. And so it has label for the first name. And the reason why it says label for and says model, give me the first name property of the model, is because it goes and looks for that metadata, the display for, or display name. And it says, okay, if you got a display name, show that. But if you don't, then just grab the name of the property itself. And so at first it grabbed the name of the property. We changed the display name, and now it grabs that instead. So that's how that label works. And the editor for, same kind of thing. It applies some attributes to our editor where, we can say, for example, the password, where it says, oh, you want an editor for, which would normally be a text box, but I see that your metadata says that you're a password. Therefore, I'll create the password text box so that you can't read the characters being typed into it. And so all that stuff gets done in the editor for. And then if you don't put the right information in, then the validation message that goes right below it, that's right there. So you could make some modifications on this form where you move these things around. Maybe you want to see all the validation messages at the top instead of underneath the box itself, which I wouldn't recommend because it's nicer to see them right where they're at. But say you did. Well, you can just take these lines and move them to the top. So this allows you a lot more functionality and configuration ability. And it was just as fast to create as that editor for model. All right, so we have data going into our form. And again, we're going to move kind of quickly through these different areas. And if you want more detail on something, I've got probably another video that covers it in more detail. But I want to make sure that we move this data through the process. So we've got data in the front end. We've got this employee model. And now we need to actually capture it. So let's do this. Copy. And I'm going to paste it again. And the first thing it's going to do is yell at me because I have a duplicate method name. But I want to keep it that name. So what I'm going to do instead is add an attribute at the top that says HTTP post. So when you ask for a get, when you say, well, I'm going to get the information, get the form, it's going to load this method. But when you send data from the form, it's going to send it to this method. And we're going to say that the data coming back is the employee model. We're going to say add that user statement. We'll call it model. Now, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to validate that anti-forgery token. Remember I said on the form itself, we have this anti-forgery token. The other half of this, so you put this on the form itself, just as it is, it creates that hidden field. And the other half of that is just to say, validate it. That's it. So we've now validated the anti-forgery token. Next, we're going to say if model state, this is one of those built-in things to MVC, is valid. So if it's valid, it's going to check this model. And it's going to say, is it a valid model? Meaning, does it comply with all these rules? the compared to and the lengths and all the rest. And you may say, well, yeah, but we're doing that check already in the front end. Why would you do it again? And the reason why you do it again is because there may be a way to spoof the front end's interaction, or maybe you turn off JavaScript, because that's really all that is JavaScript. So you could say, you know what? Trick JavaScript into believing it's valid data and then submit. And so there's a workaround there that you could do. You never want to trust just one layer of security, and you never want to trust front end client side scripting as your only means of validating data. So we're going to validate a second time and just say model state.is valid. And if it is, we're going to run this code. If it's not, we're going to return the view. What that does is it sends us right back to the same page we were on. But if it's valid, let's do a return redirect to action. And we'll just say, go back to the home page. So go back to the index action. So what it's going to do is going to post the data. And if it comes back as valid and it posts, then it's going to redirect us back to the home page. We'll see that in action in just a minute. Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. Get this started. We'll fill out the form and make sure that it fills out properly. And then we'll see how it hits the breakpoint. So sign up and let's fill out valid data this time. And we'll give it a really strong password. 123456789 and hit create. So this is a valid form. We've got 6 numbers for employee ID. First name, last name are both filled in. Email addresses match and they're valid email addresses. And the password has 10 characters and it matches a confirmed password. So hit create and it goes right here and hits our breakpoint. And if we look at the model has all of our data in it. It's a little small, but it has all of our data in it. So it also says the model state is valid. So if we just hit continue right here, it goes back to our home page. If we were trying to hit back, it's got some of the data, but the password's been wiped out because of security reasons. If we hit sign up, of course, it's all going to be gone. So now our form is posting data to our MVC controller. Now we need to take that data and put it into the database. So let's do that now. Let's close this out. All right, we can take the breakpoint off for now. So now we have our data coming into our home controller. We need to send it on to the next phase. And the next phase would be where our business logic and data access comes in. So let's set something up for that. Now, before we start with our data library, let's start with our database itself because, we're going to need to store this somewhere. So let's create that table. So start with our folder for DBO. And then inside here, I'll add a folder for tables. And then inside here, I'm going to add a table. And we'll call this table the employee table. Make this an identity. And then we're going to have we can actually, if you wanted to, just put this right next to our window. But we have employee ID, first name, last name, email, and password. So employee ID. And that's different from our ID. Our ID identifies one row in the database. Our employee ID is something that we give employees to identify them. We don't want to mix the two because then that causes all kinds of problems. So keep them separate. I will make this into a numeric field. So actually type int. And then we'll say, no, we're not going to allow nulls. We'll say first name We'll say that's an nvarchar50. Oops, not null. Last name nvarchar50. Then we have our email address nvarchar50. I'm putting at 50. Really, those aren't realistic. Email address can be very much longer than 50. So technically, I think it can be, oh my goodness, I think it can be over 1,000 characters. Now, I can imagine that business card, but in theory, it could happen maybe. I would assume it'd be for some kind of automated system. But for the most part, you want your email address probably to be at least 100 characters long. That's pretty much the upper limit of people's email addresses. But you want to get those edge cases in there as much as possible. So I wouldn't stay 50, but for this demo database, we'll stay at 50. And the other thing here is I'm going to put this. I'm going to put it as, you know what I'm going to do? No, I'm not going to do it. It just pains me too much. I'm going to pretend like we're not even storing the password. Okay. So I could put it here and just to show that it works, but it concerns me that people might emulate me or put passwords in clear text in the database. And that's not a good thing. Not okay. So there's very, 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 very few reasons why you would put a password in clear text in the database. The only reason I can think of is it's not really a password. It's more just a separator, some way of separating yourself from somebody else. That's, for internal systems where everybody knows everybody else's password, maybe. But, I've worked with clients that do this and it's okay for certain circumstances. But really, if I'm going to have to give a general rule, don't put passwords in the database, period. So I'm not going to put a password there. We're going to leave it as just this. We're not going to collect that password. So we've now saved the employee table and we're done there. That's all the tables we're going to create. We're not going to create, lots of tables or views. We're not going to create a store procedure. We're just going to have the employee table. So let's go ahead and publish this just so we have that created. So I'm going to go to browse, local, my local DB. We're going to call this MVC Demo DB. And I'm going to save this profile. And let's create it in the, let's create a new folder. So a new folder is going to be publish profiles. Like so. There we go. And now we're going to say publish. And that should go out to our local DB SQL Server. Should create a SQL Server for us. It did. And we should have one table in there called employee. We do. And it's got our columns in there, employee ID, first name, last name, and email address. So we're all set now with our table. Let's move on to the next piece, which is actually wiring up and connecting to that table so we can take our data from our MVC and put it right into SQL. The first thing I'm going to do is add that connection string just so I have it. So web.config. And we need to add a section here since there isn't one. We need to add a section for connection strings. Make sure there isn't a section first before you start adding one. Add the name. We're going to call this MVC Demo DB because it matches the database. That's typically my pattern is to match the database name with your connection name. Connection string equals, we're going to leave it blank for a minute. Going to go over to my Object Explorer, go to my local DB, my MVC Demo DB, right click on it, and we're going to look for properties. One of the properties is connection string. So I double click there, I hit copy, I paste it in right there, and we're good to go. So now it's a connection to my demo DB. Pretty simple stuff. Especially since I'm not actually doing anything. Just copy and pasting. So now I have that in my web config of my front end project, because that's where the web config lives, is in your front end user interface. Whether it's WPF, WinForm, console app, MVC, doesn't matter. That's where your config file lives. If it's a desktop app, it's app.config. If it's a web app, it's web.config. All right, now we can go to our data library, and we're going to add a couple of classes. So let's add first a folder. We'll call it models. And in here, we're going to create a model for our data. We're going to call it employee model. And you might be freaking out right now because I have employee model. It's right here. Why wouldn't I use this for data access? And the reason hopefully become clear over time. This is a front-end user interface model that's entirely different than our business logic / data access model. So the difference, all this stuff right here is MVC specific, all the display name for the range, all the rest. We wouldn't want to decorate this if we were putting it into a console application, because we wouldn't need these things. Now, we can shoehorn some of this stuff in here, but really this is for the display side of things. On the other hand, the database doesn't care. Okay? It doesn't care about these modifiers. It only cares about the property itself. So they are two different things for two different purposes. So it is okay, and it's not repeating ourselves, to create a different model. We should. Here's the other reason why. We have email address and confirm email address. Why do we have two properties for one thing? Well, because this is what the user is filling in for both of these. Well, my employee model over here is not going to have two email fields. Okay, so these are definitely different things. The other thing is we can also have an ID here for the table. Notice this table has ID separate from employee ID. That's the row ID. So I'm going to store that actually in this model. That was wrong. The other thing is I'm not grabbing the password. So we're going to have to map these two together because we're going to have data in this model, and we're going to need to get it in this model. And that's okay. And there are some tools out there. We're not going to use a tool today. We're going to do it manually just to see how it works. But you can create tools, or you can use tools off a shelf like AutoMapper is a pretty decent tool for this kind of stuff, where it takes one model and maps it to another model, because it's a very common thing to do in applications. You really should be mapping data from one model to another. That indicates you're using your models correctly. If you're passing the same model around for everything, you might be using the models incorrectly. Or at least you're not using them as efficiently as you can. So there's options. I mean, I have used models all the way up through because they work. I don't have to make any modifications. So it is possible. It does keep things simpler. But when you come to a case like this, you want to map. So we're going to do that in just a minute. Next, we're going to create a folder. Create a folder right here. We'll call this, let's just call it logic. So, in fact, let's call it business logic, just to be more clear. And we'll create another folder, and we're going to call it data access. Now, this is a simplified view. It's not going to be the full-featured 3-layer or n-layered application, but it does kind of simulate some of those layers because that's what the data is going to go through. So let's create a data access layer first. We'll create this. We'll call it SQL Data Access. Make it public. Now this is where we're going to actually do our data access to the database. So let's add in my favorite tool, which is Dapper, if you didn't know already. So let's look for Dapper. We'll install that. And once it's installed, We can ignore that error. Once it's installed, now we can do is we can actually add a using statement for Dapper. And then we'll also add a using statement for system.configuration and a using statement for system.data, well, .data first, and then using system.data.SQL client. So those are the four we're going to be using primarily. So I'm just going to add them up front instead of doing a control dot every time. Just makes my life a little easier. So the first thing we're going to do is let's get our connection string. Let's kind of wrap it in a little function. And let's make this, there's no reason not to make it static. We're not going to store data here. So we'll make a public static string get connection string. Now we could pass in a connection string value. So let's do that. String connection name equals, I'm going to default it to our MVC demo DB, just because that's the one we're going to be commonly using. So therefore, I don't have to actually specify it for the common scenarios. And this is really simple. We're going to return the configuration manager. I had to hit control dot here and add the using system.configuration. That's a DLL. So I do that as a DLL and pop it open there. It's right there. So now to add that, then I can say dot connection strings, square brackets, and then connection name. That's passing in the variable, and then dot connection string. What that'll do is go out and get the connection string. If you don't give it a connection name, it's going to get the MVC demo DB, which we just set up. So that's perfect. So that just kind of shortens this whole call down to a little more reasonable size. And now let's create a public static load data. Oops. T. Load data of type T. And we'll do a string SQL. And let's leave it like that for now. So we're making this very, very simple. I'm not going to even allow them to pass in parameters. We're going to do a load. I'm just going to say, you know what? You're getting all of it. No, that's not totally ideal because, yes, you want parameters. But for our test scenario, that's all the stuff I need to do. And so why create this elaborate data access system when I really need to do one job? So it's going to do that one job and do it well. So I'm going to add my using statement here. I'm going to say DB connection. We'll say CNN equals new SQL connection. And this is going to grab the get connection string. All right, so I get the connection string from this method right here, and I put it into here, and then open that SQL connection. So then in here, I can say return, I'm really simplifying this, but return cnn.query of type T, pass in SQL. And the one thing I got to do here is it's actually returning not T, but list of T. And it's still going to yell at me because I'm not returning a list here. This is an I enum. And I say to list. Okay, so what I'm doing here, it seems really, really simple, and it really is. But at the same time, it can be confusing the T's. So let's talk this through. We're going to say load data, and here's the model I want you to load it into. And that's the T. And so it's going to return back a list of that model. And so I connect to SQL, and I say, okay, give me this SQL, and there's a SQL, the string to call, whether it be a store procedure, probably not, or just a select star from or whatever. And it's going to execute that SQL, and it's going to load that query into type T. Now this query returns an IEnumerable. Well, I don't want an IEnumerable. I want a list. So I say .toList. Return that whole thing, and now that's all we need to load data if we don't need parameters. So that's all well and good, but we're not really interested in loading data yet. We want to save data. We have data already. So let's look at that. Public static void. We're not going to return anything. We're just going to say, yes, it worked. Actually, you know what? Let's return int. That's the number of rows affected, just so we have something to return. I'll say save data. And we'll say of type T. I'll say string SQL and then T data. Okay, so it's going to save one model. So that's a data it's going to save using this SQL statement right there. So we're going to copy this using up here. But instead of this right here, we're going to say return cnn.execute. Here's my SQL. And then here's my parameters. Oops, it's not T, it's data. There we go. So data is my parameters. Now we're not putting that into a special dynamic parameter list. We're not creating an anonymous object. We're saying that the object you pass in, that will have the parameters matched up to hopefully the parameters in the SQL itself. It should. And so we're going to match those two up. So if it has an @firstName in the SQL, we're going to look in the object called data for a first name property and take that value and replace it. So that's what we're going to use parameterized SQL for. So this is all the save method does. We're returning this because it returns the number of records affected, hopefully 1 every time. So as long as it says 1, we're good to go. Next, let's create our business logic class. So a new class. Let's call this employee processor. Let's say public. Let's create a method in here called public. And you know what? We can even make this static as well. We don't have to make these classes instantiatable because we're not going to store data here. This is a processor. So public static. Let's return back a int for number of records affected. And we'll say create employee. And what we need to pass in to create that employee, we're not going to pass a model in. We're going to pass in employee ID. Whoops, it's an int. A string first name, string last name. That's getting kind of long, so let's go ahead and hit enter after string, or before string. And then say after last name, we'll say string email address. And am I missing anything? Let's look at my model. ID, employee ID, first name, last name, email address. Nope, we're good. So we're passing those 4 values in. Guess what we're going to do now? Now we're going to say the employee model, control dot add using for our data library dot models. Don't add a reference to MVC app. That's the wrong direction. You don't want to do that. Internally, we want to say data library dot models because this is the one you want to refer to. Let's call this data equals new employee model. Let's do the curly braces, not the open and close parens, and say the employee ID equals employee ID. First name equals first name. Last name equals last name. And email address equals email address. And guess what? We've now mapped our model from one to the other. So now we can say return SQL Data Access dot, control dot first, add that using statement, dot save data. We can just pass in our SQL statement, which we don't have yet. Let's call it SQL. And our data. Now I don't have to specify the T here, the type here. I have to say, of type employee model. I could, I don't have to. And the reason why is because I'm passing in this, and that's of type T. So I can say, okay, well, if that's a type T, then I know what the type T type is. And can I say type one more time? So that makes it a little shorter type. Okay, and we can have strings SQL equals. And what's our SQL statement going to look like? Well, let's make sure we put the @ symbol in front here. That way we can do multiple lines without having to do that plus and their line, all the rest. So you'll see in a minute. Insert into DBO, oops, spell it right, Tim. DBO dot employee ID, first name, last name, email address. I want to keep it all on one line. I think I will. Say enter here. There, I'm cheating. All right. So now I can say values. I can say at employee ID, at first name, at last name, and at email address. And where do those come from? Well, this is parameterized SQL. And so the @ indicates this is a variable. And it's going to say, okay, employee ID. Does the data you pass me along with this SQL statement, which is this right here, does it have a property called employee ID? Why, yes, it does. Well, does it have a value? Yep. So put that value right here. The really cool thing is first name, last name, and email address are all strings. But notice there's no single quotes and all the rest. It's smart enough to know, oh, that's a string. Therefore, wrap that in single quotes. So you don't have to put those single quotes. You shouldn't put those single quotes there because it would actually cause a problem. So there you go. So now you've got your parameterized SQL and you've got your data. So now it returns that value. So our business logic is done for creating the employee. Let's create the next piece, which is public static list of employee model. And yes, we're passing employee model up the chain. We don't have to. We could map it as something else. We could even return dynamic if you wanted to, but we're going to return employee model from this library. So it's going to be this employee model, not the one down here in our MVC app, which is actually hidden right now. So employee model, we're going to say load employees. And so all we're going to do here is we're going to say string SQL equals select employee ID. Actually, we're going to get ID as well. Employee ID, first name, last name, email address. Oops, didn't add my @ symbol here. Let's do that. So now I can just hit enter here. Put in multiple lines. From dbo.employees. So really simple SQL statement. It's just selecting everything. Which I can now say return, oops, no semicolon. When you start typing, it's over here or somewhere wonky. The reason why is because you forgot something in the line above. So I forgot the semicolon at the end, so I thought I was continuing my thought from the previous line. Return SQL Data Access dot load data. And the data we want to load is employee model. We have to put that in the paren or in the angle brackets because we're not passing T in somewhere. There's our SQL. It's not parameterized because there's no parameters to pass in. So now it's going to load all of our employees back. So now there our data access and business logic layers are done. We can come back into our MVC app, come to our home controller. And since this model state is valid, now we can do is we can add a reference to our, let's go to browse our data library here. Hit OK. We don't need to add a reference to our SQL project, just so you know. So now here we can say is, let's add a using statement first, just make it a little easier. So I'll say using data library. And we can say we want to call the business logic, so employee processor. Oops, using .business logic. That's why. All right, employee processor dot create employee. We pass in all the data we need. Now, this makes it a little bit longer of a call. So I'm going to show you something we can do here. I'm actually going to cut that out. Go up at the top here, hit dot and add it in. And it says, no, you can't do that. Unless I do this using static. And this is one of those new things, I believe in C# 7 or 7.1, one of those. What it allows us to do is add a static up here all the way up through the class name. So that down here, we can just say create employee as if it was a method in here. Now, obviously, if you're going to step on toes, that would be a problem, meaning you have a create employee method already in here. So, but we don't, so we're good. So model.employee ID, model.first name, model.last name, and model.email address. Not to confirm, don't worry about it. And I got an extra close paren at the end. And let's make this a little neater here. So there's our create employee. We could capture this. So int recs records created equals, and there it's our call. And now we're not going to do anything with that. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint here so we can actually just read it and make sure that it says 1. So hopefully with all that being done, our data access for creating a new employee should work. Let's find out if it actually does work. So we'll load this up. Takes a little bit to load, but as long as you know what you're doing, hopefully you can do a little more work before you just keep loading it up. I've done quite a bit of work right now, which is hopefully all work. That's the one problem with doing a lot of work. Remember that we're not saving the password. We hit create. The breakpoint gets hit. Records created says 1. Our model has all of our data in it. So if I hit go, it's going to go right back to the home page. If I close this out and stop the project, come over to SQL Server Object Explorer, go to my local DB, and let's say view data. And there is employee ID number 1, or I'm sorry, ID number 1, employee ID number 123456, Tim Corey, and my email address. And that was validated in the front end to make sure it's a valid email address, make sure it matched what I typed the first time, and it made sure the employee ID was a valid employee ID, or at least in the valid range. So all these things have already been validated a couple times, which is great. So that right there allows us to see all of our data. Our data is gone from the front end all the way through our application, our business logic, which wasn't much, it was just change it a little bit, and then put it into our database through our data access code. So that's the whole process from start to finish, from top to bottom. Now let's go the other direction, from bottom to top, take our data from our database, through our data access, into our business logic, into our controller UI in the front end, and then finally to our screen. So we need to create a view for this. So let's create a view right above sign up. We'll say public action result view employees. And we'll say that the view bag dot message equals employees list. And we're going to say, we'll start with a return view. But before we actually complete this, I need to make a call to my business logic, so the employee processor. So let's say instead of create data or create employee, it is called load employee. So let's do that. So let's say our list is just say var for now. It's the easiest. Data equals load employees, and we don't need to pass anything in. It just loads all the employees. Now this data, if we mouse over it, it says, well, it's a list of data library.models.employee model. That could be okay. So we could just take those data models, since they're just displaying, we could take those and just display them, or we could transform them. And so the transformation process, this is where AutoMapper is kind of nice, because it's an automatic process and it's a little more concise. We could just do a for each here. So we can do a for each and then convert it over to our existing employee model over here. So it's up to us how we do it. I think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to do a for each, just kind of show off what we do here. So list of employee model. Notice we mouse over this. This is the MVC app.models.employee model. So this would be the employees equals new list of employee model. This is where the var really helped me, because I didn't have to set up and say data library.models.employee model. I can say var. And now I can do is say for each item or row, let's say row, in data. That's my existing employees from the database in the model we don't want to display. I'm going to say employees.add new employee model, the curly brace, and say employee ID equals row.employee ID. Then first name equals row.first name. And last name equals row.last name. And email address equals row.email address. Now we also have confirm email address equals row.email address. I'll load them the same, because if I were to display both, which I'm not going to, but if I were going to, then I want to have both filled in. Let's just say I'm going to allow them then to edit an employee. I wouldn't want them to have to retype that email address if it's already valid. So I'm going to fill in both here. The password, I don't know, which is okay. I wouldn't want to pass the password back through anyway. So now what that'll do is it's going to add a new employee for every data entry. And now I can pass this into my view. So now I have a list of employees. I can right click on view employee, say add view. I'm going to say it's a list. And it's of type employee model, but it is the MVC app.models, not data library.models. I hit add. It's going to scaffold the whole thing out. Notice it has employee ID, first name, last name, email, confirm email, password, and confirm password. Don't want those. So let's just delete those out. And then same down here, because that was the header rows. And now I can delete the data rows. And it does have the edit, details, and delete, which I'm not going to create. So let's go ahead and leave those off. So now here's here's my new record. I'm going to say, you know what? For the create new, sure, let's leave that on here. But instead of saying create, it's sign up. That's my action, is sign up. So I'll say view employees. That all looks good. Let's run this and see what it shows us. So hopefully here we're going to have one employee, and we don't. It goes, whoops, nope, we don't. So we say invalid object name dbo.employees. Let's find out why. So our SQL statement says grab it from dbo.employees, but it's saying invalid object name dbo.employees. So I'm assuming what that means is that, let's just see if there's an inner exception. There probably won't be. There is not. So I assume that means is we've got a typo here. Let's look at its employee table, not employees. So I got singular versus plural mixed up there. My bad. So let's go over to my my business logic where we have the employee processor. And right here, I need to delete that S. Now, if I start it from here, what it's going to do is going to start at the home page, which I haven't, just as I'm thinking, I haven't put a link to go to the view employees. But if I start it from the view employees.cs HTML, it will start right on that page. So just so you know, but I will put that link in the layout.cs HTML. So we have sign up, and let's get rid of contact and about. Let's paste in this link right here. We'll say view employees. And we're going to say that this action method, and I've already forgotten what it is view employees. So there you go. Just always verify instead of just trying to type it yourself. Otherwise, you put employees versus employee or something like that. So I started on a CS HTML, so it's going to start the home page. Not a big deal, but if you want to go right to the page you're working on, it's nice to already be on that CS HTML. So we have a sign up, we have view employees. Let's view employees. And there we go. We have Tim Corey, and we have create new, which takes us over here. Let's create a new one. And we'll say that this is Mary Jane. And the password, she's a little bit more secure than I am. She starts at 0 and goes up. Create. Now what I could do is, instead of going to the home page, I could go right to the view employees, which now has Mary Jane. So I can make that modification if I wanted to. But really now we have a complete application with data going both directions. We have data coming from a database, going all the way up through the stack and into our user interface, our MVC application in a view. And we have data going the other direction where we're taking it from the user interface all the way down the stack into our database. So this has been an example, kind of a little higher level overview than normal, where I've showed multiple pieces, kind of faster than normal as well, because really what I want you to see is how the pieces you've been building and how you've learned little pieces over time. Hopefully you've learned the different pieces I've shown, but how those kind of fit together into a larger picture. And this larger picture is how data access works in MVC. One of the questions I get a lot is, well, how do you do data access with X? Whether it be MVC or .NET Core or WPF or WinForms or Console, whatever user interface you're talking about. And it really sometimes confuses me because I say the answer is the same no matter what. And that's because this data library can now attach to WinForm application, or can attach to a console application, or any other user interface you want to put on it, really, because the logic and the data access stays the same. So the MVC app is just user interface. It's just for displaying information and getting and sending information on to be worked on. Now, there was some tricky bits, and I understand that. So there was some tricky bits about how we translate those models from one model to another. I kind of show you, a couple of the examples of different ways you can do it. But really what it comes down to is a user interface should just be about displaying information and getting information, not really about making decisions on that information or saving that information. You shouldn't have data access right in your MVC application. It should definitely be in a class library somewhere. I hope it's been helpful. I hope that this kind of higher level view has kind of shine a light on how this process works from start to finish. Now, again, this is one of the processes in creating a full MVC application or a full application in general. But it is that larger process of how the flow works. And that's the most important part of an application is the data flow. Hope you found it valuable. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below in the comments, and I will try and get back to you as soon as possible. I'd appreciate it if you would give me a thumbs up. That's always helpful. And also, subscribe if you're not subscribed. Otherwise, have a great day. And as always, I am Tim Corey.